On behalf of the Spurlock Museum, thank you all for coming to tonight's event. I would like to begin by recognizing and acknowledging that the museum and the university are on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These lands were the traditional territory of these native nations prior to their forced removal. These lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for identity and survival. My name's Beth Watkins. I'm the coordinator of the museum's current exhibit, Debates, Decisions, Demands, Objects of Campaigns and Activism. And tonight is the final event in a related series of discussions of films that focus on political involvement and activism from around the world in different time periods. And I could not be more excited to welcome tonight's featured discussant, Nilanjana Bhattacharya. Uh, she is a principal lecturer at Barrett the Honors College at Arizona State in Tempe. She teaches interdisciplinary seminars in the humanities and writes on music, literature, and visual culture in South Asia and in the South Asian diaspora. Her publications have focused on popular music in South Asia and the South Asian diaspora, as well as on popular Hindi film, where she has written on how more recent popular Hindi films use music in their stories, engage with streaming technologies, and represent issues related to gender and sexuality, fans and stars, marginalized cultures, and regional identities. She and I connected on Twitter a long time ago, many years ago, and we're both really happy to be able to speak together and with you all this evening. We invite you to use the Zoom Q&A function for any questions or comments during the discussion, and I'll be monitoring those to be sure to bring them up. And there'll be lots of time at the end for discussion. The captions are running if you'd like to turn those on, and I will be putting this up on the museum's YouTube channel in a few weeks. With that, I turn things over to our guest to begin our discussion.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, Beth, and thanks, attendees, so all over the place, for joining us today. It's a pleasure. So, when Beth had invited me to talk about this film, I had to think about it a bit because it had been a while since I had heard about it. So, some of you might know that the film was released a while back, almost 20 years ago now, which is hard to think. But since then, so much has changed in terms of the political climate in India, of course, and as a result of that, what kinds of films are being made. So today, when we're thinking about films that have to do with political ideas or patriotism or ideas of nationalism, what we see on screen now and over the last couple of years is very, 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 very different than what we see here. So if we're thinking about major sort of blockbuster, nationalist, patriotic films, so lately they have, well, we can think of lots of films that are sort of semi-mythological, sort of historical films, especially. But earlier today, I was sharing notes with Beth about the Kangana Ranaut movie, Makakarnika, where she is sort of the Rani of Jhansi, and she's very militaristic, sort of warrior on a horse with a baby on her back and a sword. So lots of CGI warriors to behead. I don't know what she does because I didn't read the movie, but in any case, that kind of movie and that kind of action movie, and we also see that a little bit with Padmavat. Um, it's a very different kind of movie than what we see here in this film, which is much more focused on ideology, really, and the violence that we see in the film is really in the background for most of the film. So, I guess, I mean, I probably want to ask you, Beth, at the start. So, what was it like for you to visit this film after what I'm assuming is a while?
I had never seen it actually, and I I was struck by a couple things. One of them was it felt like they were unloading a lot of facts on us, clustered in particular areas, but there was a lot of very quick reference to particular historical events that weren't developed in those references weren't really developed. They were maybe not even plot points, but they would just refer to something quickly and then move on as though they'd been given kind of like a syllabus outline that they had to check off. But I also didn't feel like it was pedantic particularly. So I thought that was a tricky balancing act that they mostly pulled off. Then again, I did not grow up knowing much of this history at all. So um, I think for those who did, this might feel, maybe it feels a little repetitive or covering ground that perhaps people would have rather spent time on some action, like you were mentioning. Um, and I also felt like, so I'm really, one of the things I'm really excited to hear your thoughts about is how the music is used, and we can get to that. But, some of the conventions of typical Bollywood films felt really weird here. Like the love interest is obviously, it does not, I don't think it needs to be there whatsoever. It really, um, the poor thing, her one song is a is a dream sequence because they have no relationship, and maybe some of the scenes with his mother were maybe a little bit much, but overall I thought um it for me it did not drag, even though there's, despite the sort of exposition aspect of it, and I did feel quite moved by it, partly because it also, I'm sure we'll talk about this too. This is not the Gandhi you usually see in popular Hindi films, and that was really interesting. Like that jolted me every time he came on screen because it wasn't what I was expecting, and how this could never be made today in this way. I wouldn't think so. Um, yeah, I do feel like I learned things from it, but it also felt like a successful film just as a film.
Yeah. I had that same experience of needing to Google events. I mean,
Oh
things
yeah.
I knew sort of vaguely in my mind, but I hadn't quite strung together the sequence, I guess, in my own mind. Or if I had, I'd read it many, many, many years ago because I learned about the Boston Tea Party and the 1812 War and all of that before I
Yeah.
learned about Bhagat Singh, so decades before. So, yeah, sort of thinking about how everything fit together, and especially the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, so
Mm.
being such an incredibly powerful moment in his radicalization. That was fascinating for me, and that sort of moment where things change and he sort of forms this political outlook that never actually changes throughout his life is really, I think that was really powerful and well sustained through the film. As for music, yes, I mean the love interest, oh, it, they never actually get married, so why she's actually hanging around at the house we're not quite sure,
No.
and she knows he's going to die because he sort of tells her as much. So yes, there's not much on her,
No.
as far
No.
as I can tell. As when I was looking for historical documents, people said that this was a bit of a liberty. So I guess a more generous take would be that they include her as a beautiful woman who was young and lovely, not as somebody to be developed, but just an example, right, of the sacrifice that he makes, uh, leaving his family and the life that most people his age would be able to lead. So she doesn't really have a character.
Oh no, no, not at all. She has a few friends who giggle, and that's about. And she giggles a bit, and that's about it.
Yeah. And casting wise, you brought up the mother. So Farida Jalal, of course, always plays mothers. So of course, the next thing I do is to Google the birth dates of the lead actor and
Oh,
the parents. I had to do that
yes.
because yes, you have to do that. So there's a 20-year age gap between him and his mother, which is, I mean, historically that adds up.
Yeah.
Probably that would have been
Yeah.
the case. What's
Yeah.
fascinating to me is that there's a 17-year age gap between the man who plays his father
Oh,
and the lead actor. So
I did not know that. Yeah.
these are the kinds of things I look up because
Yeah.
I get curious.
Well, Suresh Oberoi has, booming narrator, historical gravitas voice. So
Yeah.
him as a political activist in his own, if I understood the film correctly,
Yeah.
um, I bought him as that. I didn't even think to look it up. he
Yeah.
seemed to
Yeah.
have the right, a sufficient presence for that role.
No, he was fine. So it's just the dad. The dad being 17 years older than Ajay Devgan is an interesting move. They aged him in the film somewhat at
Yes,
times, but
yeah.
he was an interesting choice. So the music, um, so yeah, this is not a movie that had a soundtrack that was really, really, really popular. But the songs are good, and it's a strong soundtrack. But as many people says, it reminds you, I think, of other soundtracks.
Mm.
So there's this patriotic sound that Rahman uses in a lot of films, and it's interesting to think about how many films that he's done. If we're thinking about this film, if we're thinking about Bose the Forgotten Hero, if we're thinking about Lagan, if we're thinking, I can't remember if he did the music for Mangal Pandey, but I think he might have.
Surely he did. Yeah, I think so.
So
Sounds like him.
there's some overlap there, right?
Yeah.
In terms of thinking about how one constructs a revolutionary sound, what kinds of
He did
songs.
Yuva also, which is
Yes.
very much a political film too.
Yeah. So these songs about political consciousness and Rang de Basanti obviously
Mm.
as sort of mobilizing people are very much part of what we associate him in. But that the first song sequence I thought was a song sequence. It was choreographed. It was on screen in time, and it was lovely because you thought you were about to see this presentation for the British governors at the school that was supposed to be, well, people thought was going to be praising the British governors. And then we see Bhagat Singh and his crew basically hijack it as a Punjabi anti British imperialism song. And it's a beautiful thing to see on stage. So I liked that, and that was relatively early on in the movie, and it was a surprise.
Hmm.
And then the other songs are mostly sort of in the background. We're not really getting people singing and dancing, except for the Unfortunate Dream sequence love song that you mentioned. So,
I also really like that opening song, and it works well as a hero introduction, I think.
mhm.
Um, Not just for this character, but I would maybe argue even for this actor, like kind of is macho in a way that suits this particular setting fairly well. But also, reads as a it's not an unexpected song necessarily, but I think I think it works pretty well. Obviously, he's not a major dancer, but it was fine. And that idea of like putting him with a bunch of comrades in dance was a nice precursor to the comrades that that he will fight with going forward in the film. So I actually liked that fairly well. And I did. I mean, it's always fun to stick it to the British in the colonial era, so I'm all for that.
Especially if it's a ruse and they don't know,
Right.
and they're clapping, and then all of a sudden they stop.
Ooh.
Yeah, it was lovely. You're right. So it's a great character introduction song because we only
Mm-hmm.
hear a little bit about Bhagat Singh as a sort of abstract entity when the other students are being introduced on the campus, and we see Sukhdev sort of harassing people and trying to figure out whether or not they'll join his movement or not. And then, what about that? The quiet, really thin, tall Punjabi guy. What about him? Oh, he's going to be in the British thing too? Oh my gosh. Let's suss him out. So, yeah, then of course everything's okay. So, yeah, I enjoyed the music, but
What did
it,
you think about the song at the end where they are being marched to the gallows and they're singing fairly cheerfully about um like a wedding march, we walk to wed the revolution and but mother paint my shroud the color of saffron and looking fairly cheerful. How did that one work for you?
it worked in a way that wasn't meant to, which is that all it made me think of was the final scenes in Rang de Basanti.
Oh, sure.
So, which is obviously based, right? These things we're quoting this event, but yeah, it's a similar kind of mode, right? So male bonding, male
Yes.
friendship,
Yeah.
loyalty, and all of this sort of being something that nobody can touch. So it's very much about the bromance. I the end. There are no women really
No,
in
no.
in the film other than the mother and the poor fiance.
Oh, and there was that one woman who's in
Oh
their kind of
yes.
planning room for about 2 seconds, and she says a few things, but she's
She's
very
in the planning
cursory.
room for 2 minutes. I think her big role is that she pretends to be the fake British outfitted Bhagat Singh's wife and mother of his small baby
That's
when they
right.
board the train to Calcutta. That's her
Right.
big role. She actually was in real life a person.
I was
Who
wondering. I'm glad that you looked that up.
I did. So
Good.
that was Durga. Durga. So she's actually played by, in a very small role, Soha Ali Khan in Rang de Basanti. She shows
Oh,
up
of
too.
course. Yeah.
But yeah, she was married to one of the people. I forget which. I should remember, but she does. She seems to be present, but I think yes, her big sort of structural role is to help Bhagat Singh leave and go to Calcutta after the train robbery.
Think about if there are any. When you were, are there films that are political in topic that have songs that you like that really have stayed with you since you saw them, or that you think about often, maybe for other reasons not related to their use in the film? Because I was trying to think about political film, the soundtracks from political films, and I didn't get very
Mm.
far, and that might be because I don't watch as many of those. But and bizarrely, one of the ones that came to mind was Kelain Hum Jijan from what, 10, 12 years ago with Deepika Padukone and Abhishek Bachchan and all. And I remember being some of that music. Why, I don't know, because that film was not particularly well received or regarded either. But it was interesting for doing not these group of freedom fighters, but other freedom fighters in another part of the area. But I don't think about political songs very often for film songs.
Yeah, I don't know. I think there's a lot of emphasis on these very rousing anthems, and of course the slogans become really important. So if we're thinking about Lagan and Chalo Chalo Chalo,
Sure, yeah.
it's usually these songs are about either sort of depicting the mobilizing of people, in which you start with a small group, and then of course the intensity of the music builds and the crowd gets bigger, and then sooner or later by the end of the song you have a movement. So there's a functional kind of role that the music takes in trying to substantiate how the movements build. So you see that function, I think, in this song,
Mm-hmm.
in this movie. So the songs in this movie take that role throughout. But as a category, I guess I find them less interesting because they seem to be so formulaic. A
Sure,
lot of them.
sure.
And I
Yeah,
think American political songs are sort of the same, right? I mean, there are only so many kinds of expressions of nationalism and nationalist patriotic sentiment that we
yeah.
get. They tend to be pretty cliched, and as yeah, I mean, they're different, obviously, in the Indian films and the Indian revolutionary context, but the kinds of emotions and lyrics and such that are being mentioned are not necessarily unique or fresh.
Right, right.
So I wish I could say something more positive
No,
about
that's
them.
fine. Well, I mean,
They're
it's
just like,
interesting that for you
yeah.
too, they don't really stand out particularly.
No. So do we have any questions though
We
from our?
do. We have
Yeah.
one from
Oh, we have lots of questions.
Mary in Champaign Urbana, who's I'll out her. She's a librarian. We love her.
Oh.
And she says, in what ways do you think patriotic movies will change or stay the same in the next 5 years? That's a doozy of a question.
Ooh. I've been talking a lot. I'm gonna let you start.
I think they will be excessively, I cannot think of a formal word for this at the moment, but suck up. They are going to be, I mean, even more so than they already have been. I did watch Manikarnika, the Kangana Rano movie about the Rani of Jhansi. By the way, I apologize for the auto transcripts from Zoom. These are not the words we are saying, but we'll clean them up. Um, So I mean, the Modi government is a nightmare for the film industry, pretty much top to bottom, with the exception of a few people who have chosen to align themselves basically against their industry and with Modi. And uh, I think there will not be very many overtly political films, and those that are going to be extremely favorable towards the current regime. We have had a couple of political films recently. There was a biopic about Modi, right? With Vivek Oberoi, right?
Something
I
like
might be
that.
mixing up films. So there's been a couple, political thrillers that I actually don't know if they're based on real events or not. But I think in terms of depicting actual people, historical or contemporary, I mean, I would sure lay off if I were in the Hindi film industry. Now, I don't know about some of the other language industries. Obviously, Hindi is the one I think mostly entwined with the BJP and mostly closely affected by them. I know some of the southern industries will, I'm sure, take quite different stances and have the what sort of cultural capital and economic capital to do that in a way that maybe the Hindi film industry does not. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, for the Southern industry, if we're thinking about huge hits, we have Bahubali, right? That whole franchise,
Yeah.
which is not patriotic in the traditional sense, but if we're thinking about a lot of the films that have been coming out recently and which will probably continue to come out have been these historical epics, and very often they're historical slash mythological because within this cultural climate, religion and history are intertwined. So the advantage of that kind of movie is that you can make things as spectacular and ridiculous as you want in most cases, because there's not really a lot of agreement on really old sources that people are going to go after you on for not sort of representing correctly. If you want to have your hero be able to fly, why not? Who's going to
Right.
say that people
Right.
didn't
Why
do
not?
that in the third century, right? So yeah, no one can really say much at all. The story is yours to tell. So I think we are going to get more sort of historical epics, mythological kind of epics that are reasserting a more Hindu-centric vision of India. So not necessarily patriotic in the conventional sense that we would think about in terms of flag waving and chest thumpings of patriotic anthems, but more in sort of building up this narrative of a Hindu nation as being something that has always been, has sort of been there uh, in ancient times and can only continue to be. And the other category of films that we've been getting a lot of, which will also continue depending on what happens politically, is war films, battle films. So we've been revisiting and terrorist episodes. So revisiting episodes where we have major battles with Pakistan, or where there are Indian intelligence officers who save all of Bombay from Pakistani terrorists, right? So a lot of these movies, saving India from the Muslims who
Yeah.
are trying to tear India down, we do get a lot of those movies still. And Catherine is writing, uh, interesting. So you have the left parties in Kerala. Are they making their way into films then in a positive way, or is it mostly the left right divide sort of being depicted in one particular way?
Yeah. Catherine, I'm going to unmute, let you talk if you'd like to.
Please.
Go ahead. And for
What,
those who
what
don't know, Catherine is a Malayalam film expert and
I
blogger
got
from
that.
Ontario. Yeah.
fan.
Well,
Good
We're all
on
fan
you.
fans.
fan plus.
I've got the right microphone working too tonight. I mean, there are a lot of political films in the Malayalam industry,
Hmm.
and you have a lot of, and there many of them are considered classics. But you have something like Ladal Salam, which is about communists
Right.
in Kerala, and there are always sort of the tensions between communists and not communists, because I think the right is not as far right in Kerala, with some exceptions.
Hmm.
I think they're sort of they're one of the places that has kind of resisted a lot of far right incursion. But I mean, I mentioned Marakar in the comment that I made, and that's you talked about war films, and this is going to be a big historical war epic, but it's mostly how they fought against the Portuguese influx. You're not looking at within India, you're looking at forces coming from outside of India.
So that's the narrative, of course, in Padmavat as well, right? Where you have these Afghan-ish invaders sort of coming. Yeah, the British are always convenient villains, but if we get tired of them, why not the Portuguese?
Well, and we've had the British as villains in Malayalam cinema as well. We've had, you know, some very big epic films, which the Malayalam industry doesn't do wonderfully on some level because of budgets, and it's always a budget issue. So you have, you know, the some of the costumes for the British look a bit tawdry. Thematically, they're really good. I think Marakar is going to be an exception to, I think they threw a lot of budget at this, and they've been holding it off for about a year now because they don't want to do an OTT release. They want to get the money back in theaters, and they will once they get it released.
Oh, wow.
I think it's fascinating that Kangana Ranaut, you know, mouthpiece of the right-wing Hindi-speaking government, is going to play the former chief minister of Tamil Nadu in a biopic coming up.
I forgot about that.
Does she speak Tamil? I don't even know, but I'm curious about how she was cast in that, or how she got attached to that project. I'm just looking at the director's IMDb. I'm not familiar with him at all. I don't know anything about Tamil films, and if any of our participants do, please.
Yeah, I'm not.
I'll let you talk, but
I usually let other people talk about Tamil films as well, because, you know, I don't watch many of them.
But that's a pretty fascinating piece of casting, especially because they, you know, it's going to cover quite a few decades of her life, and they're radically altering her appearance in some ways, maybe not particularly successfully, as that real life figure ages and becomes more and more politically powerful. But yeah,
I wish I had
interesting.
I had more to say, but it's a big.
No, I just think it's fascinating. And she's just such a. I mean, there's obviously many actors who could perform the role perfectly well, and because she's a good actor. That's one of the problems with her, right? Is that I want to see some of her films, except I don't want to give her any more attention or money or anything. So, but I'm wondering how a non-Tamil actor became the choice for that particular role. I would have, if you'd asked me, I would have thought that would not go over very well, and maybe it hasn't. I don't actually know, but I'm curious about that film.
Who is the director?
A.L. Vijay.
Oh, so not a North Indian director.
I think so. I'm looking at his filmography, and these, I believe, are mostly Tamil films.
Yeah. Very interesting.
Yeah, so that's a major one coming up, and this makes me think of last year for a podcast I was working on. I watched, I'm blanking on the name, but the film where Suchitra Sen plays a very loosely camouflage version of Mrs. Gandhi, with Sanjeev Kumar. So it's a film from the early 80s, I believe. And that one, you know, she's a major politician in the film, but it's all focused on their emotional life, which would be another tack to take if you really feel compelled to tell a story about a political figure. I think would be to maybe not deal with their politics whatsoever. But also, what's the point then?
And there was a Tamil web series on sorry, I'm going to butcher her name, Jayalalitha, with Ramya Krishnan in the role.
Oh, yeah,
also in Mahabali. It was excellent. The problem it's probably marginalized because it's on MX Player or something, so it's limited into the number of people who can see it. But it was really, really well done.
The only thing I guess I could say is she was a film star, right?
Yeah.
So there's that.
Yeah, Yeah, which and that's a fascinating story too, and
Yeah.
because especially because that arc is so very common in India for film stars to then become politicians. So
And it looks like it's one that Kangana Ranaut herself wants to actually
right,
embark upon, or is already in the process of embarking on, so it becomes
yeah,
this interesting
yeah,
reality. Well, thanks for bringing it up, Beth. I hadn't thought about it.
yeah.
I
It's an
My
interesting
knowledge
one.
of South Indian films is so limited, and after this past year, I just didn't watch that much. I'll be
No, mine
honest.
too. Mine too. There's a lot to watch.
There's a lot out there, yeah.
So,
So,
speaking of other films that have been made about politicians, I think it's worth noting about this film that within 3 weeks of each other, there were three Bhagat Singh films in Hindi released on the big screen. That's a lot. And then apparently also a TV series, and then also another film that was completed but not released, all being made at the same time. And I was reading the article about this film by the great Philip Lukendorf at University of Iowa, who writes about and teaches about Indian cinema, and he was suggesting that, of course, and I'd completely forgotten about this. The year before this came out, we had the blockbuster of Lagan, but also Gadar. We had these history and
mm,
independence related films that were massive hits. And so that might be the impetus, but still five projects in, or even if we just count the three that released on the big
mm.
screens together, that, I mean, that those must have hurt each other, right, in terms of box office and stuff like that. Um, One of the other ones stars Bobby Deol as,
Yes,
I
I
guess,
read about that one.
interesting to think about. That's not who would leap to mind for me, but what do I know?
Yeah, poor Bobby.
And I've never heard anyone discussing that film, I don't think, even in this Bobby Renaissance in which we are currently living. But that's kind of fascinating. Oh yeah, Mary. So Mary wants to know if you've included or would you consider including this film in classes that you teach?
Hmm. I think for me, I would say probably no.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of it has to do with the reasons that Beth was sort of saying at the start. For me, sort of teaching American college students who don't necessarily have a very firm understanding of the Indian independence movement, uh, it would be hard for me to teach this without actually teaching a lot of Indian history at the start. So it's the case that there's so many different events. I was telling Beth I was making sure that sort of I had a list of everything that they were referring to in the film. So there, we already talked about the Jallianwala Bagh um, so massacre, but then they go on to talk about um,
A
the
train robbery.
yeah, the
Um,
Chowri Chowra incident also, right, which is
mhm,
why and how so Mahatma Gandhi calls off the non-cooperation movement. And then, yes, the train robbery, which is preceded by the formation of the uh, National Hindustan Republican Association.
and
Yeah.
things like I blanked on the name already, and I apologize, but the police are beating up a group of protesters, and the protesters attack the police station and kill 20 police who are all Indian, which is interesting.
Right, that was the Chowri
Oh,
Chowra
that's
incident.
sorry, yeah,
So yes, that's sort of yes, it's big, and they only mention it in like one sentence in one word. It goes by super super quickly,
yeah,
but this is the reason that Gandhi sort of pulls off the non-cooperation movement and disappoints everyone. So it's important, but it's dealt with so fleetingly. As is the train robbery. It doesn't
yeah,
really have a very big context, but that is linked to this whole generation of revolutionary fighters then being taken by the British and sort of taken out of the picture, which of course then opens a space for Bhagat Singh and his bunch to come in.
yeah.
So all these things are important, but they're kind of incidental at the same time in the way that the story is mapped out.
I agree. Yeah,
So I'd
and
be
but also a little confusing because there's so
yeah.
many of them that and like you, I was pausing and looking stuff up for the first hour of the film pretty consistently because I didn't know and I couldn't keep up with what they were mentioning, and I'm assuming most Indian audiences would be familiar with the basic sketch of these events. Um, I was curious about how your thoughts on how they chose to structure this film, mostly as a flashback. Also, if you didn't already know what happened to Bhagat Singh, they told you right away before the film even really right. So right at the very beginning, they show the gallows. So if you didn't already know, you did know. And I'm wondering about if you have any thoughts about those choices they made in terms of structure, and also to refer to so many of these events in dialogue rather than maybe some narration, which they do use at later points in the film.
I think you would have to be pretty clueless to not know that he died or he was killed
Yeah,
by the
I
British
agree. Yeah,
before
I agree.
watching the movie. So
Yeah.
I would say that that probably wasn't a huge
That's
giveaway.
not a spoiler. Yeah, yeah.
No, but I thought what was effective was the the scenes of him as a child. I thought that was really really expertly handled. Just to see him and his optimism and his excitement about Gandhi and how that gets crushed and sort of initiates his move towards his more radical, aggressive politics. Is that was beautifully handled. As far as the other events, like, did we really need to see the train robbery? I'm not sure. I mean, it's suspenseful, but
Yeah.
maybe not, right? Yes, the greatest hits of the Indian independence movement from 1919 to 1931. They're all here.
Yeah. Which, that's fair enough. Um, I, this is not my original thought whatsoever. I was reading someone who mentioned that, and I think you alluded to this already, that the idea of being disillusioned in Gandhi kind of mirrors the orphan trope we see in a lot of mainstream Hindi films. So that here's this child who is ideologically orphaned,
Mm.
um, and is radicalized. And I'm really glad you used that word. I had not thought about that word, but I think it's very appropriate and important here. And even though he is close with his biological family, and they are also politically active, so it's not like he's ideologically isolated in his home community, but he obviously is going to go to greater lengths than they ever did. Um, and with that sort of emotional heart, not just of like, I love my country and I love my fellow Indians and I want better for us all, but also that it has this sort of, again, very Bollywood-ish, I was abandoned sort of thing. And I like that idea. That's maybe why they put some of that in there.
I like it, but at the same time, I feel like so much of the story is not necessarily who abandons him, but rather what he abandons.
Right, right.
So and we'll get to this, of course, next. But I mean, his not being religious, right? Sort of his being atheist at quite a young age, turning away from his parents' traditions, and they're knowing that he does that, but he's finding this other faith, and his he values his family. As he said, he has a good relationship with his family, but he has to give them up, and they have to give him up, and they're sort of half willing, half not willing. But I don't know. I don't know if the orphan thing works for me. I don't feel like he feels abandoned by Gandhi so much as misled,
Mm-hmm. Fair.
which might be a little bit different.
Yeah, no, it is a little bit different. I agree. Agree. Um, I can think what else I kind of struck me about the film in particular. This is not the film so much. I think it's interesting that Netflix has this available. Sort of all the, when we were putting this film series together, we chose things that were available on Netflix because we thought that was fairly widely accessible and would also have subtitles and things, so we could do international films. And this is not what I would choose for representation of Indian political history to make available in other parts of the world. And I mean, obviously it can have to do with what they could get the rights to and all, but I wonder kind of how this one ended up available on Netflix when there are others that are probably better that aren't there.
Yeah, I honestly that's a big mystery for me too.
And because it wasn't a big box office success, it doesn't, this is not what Ajay Devgan is known for now. So it's not like, oh, look at this, piece of work that got him on the trajectory he's on now or anything like that. So
Right. So I warned Beth, that I would bring this up, and I won't dwell on it, but I will bring up the fact that Ajay Devgan is slightly miscast in this role. So Bhagat Singh, as many of you know, died when he's killed when he was 23 years old. And the majority of the film that we're seeing is sort of 1928 through 1931, so he would have been roughly like 19 through 23. And Ajay Devgan, at the time that the movie was released, was in his early 30s, and it shows. And at times I can see a resemblance. I think in the early scenes, especially when he's turbaned before he shaves his beard, he does look young, but he's also he's heavier set and bulkier, and he just does not look like a young, vulnerable young man, which is what we see in our iconic pictures of Bhagat Singh. So that it was interesting to choose him as a lead actor when there is this big age gap. He wasn't somebody who was particularly at the top of his. He was among sort of well-known actors and well-regarded, but he wasn't a superstar ever, and certainly not at that time. So I'm wondering why and how he got cast in 2002.
Yeah, I'm trying to think who might I have cast instead, and I'm my brain is slow to process who would have been the right age
Who
at
could
that
act?
time. But it's who could act.
There's always that.
Yeah, because this is not exactly typical. You are not going to rely upon maybe the same bag of tricks that you have for other, masala films. So, um, and no one is really leaping to mind, honestly. And in Rang de Basanti, it's Siddharth who plays this character, right?
I think so, yeah.
And he seems much more appropriate to me.
He was younger.
He was
Yeah.
younger. He's a better actor, I think. And he's I mean, he looks the part a little bit more, maybe, but
Maybe,
not
but
that matters significantly. But
well, I didn't have a problem really with trying to his acting per se. It's just
right,
he just didn't seem like a 20, 21, 22-year-old man, which is what's
yeah,
so incredible about the story of all of these people, including Jatin Das, and basically all of them were under
yeah,
24.
they're so young. They're so young.
And that doesn't come across in the film so much because
No,
they just look older.
and even when they're in college, that didn't cement them well enough for in my head for what age they were.
Yeah.
Um,
So
I
that's a
would love
small
to.
thing.
No, go ahead. Oh, I would love to call out the performance of Sushant Singh, who played Sukhdev. I thought he was really good, um, and doesn't really. I mean, I don't know the history well enough to know if what the relationship between them was in terms of who's doing what within the movement and that kind of thing. Like, is one viewed as a leader more than the other or anything like that? But um, he's so. He has a. I feel like he has and then expresses a bigger range of emotions. He's kind of more interesting to watch to me than Ajay Devgan was. Um,
He
I
gets
was,
more to do, I
yeah, he
think.
does.
So yeah, we see a much more varied personality, and he has very strong performances on screen. The minute that we see him in that first scene on campus, harassing, hazing all the young men, it's fantastic actually. And from the at one moment he captures the scene. All right, so I'm looking at our clock, so we have to talk about what we said we were going to talk about, which is that this film would never, ever,
Yes.
ever be made today. For so many reasons, it could not be made today and see the light of day. So, one of the things that is really interesting about the nature of revolution and Bhagat Singh's radicalism is the fact that he is anti-religious discrimination, he's anti-caste discrimination, and he's also anti-class discrimination. And at one point in the film, and this is something that he was also known for in his writings, he says that there's no point really in the British leaving if the Indian nation that forms is going to be taken over by elite class who continue to exploit peasants and laborers and manipulate communal tensions.
Yeah.
And that the nation will be corrupt if this in fact happens.
And there's that stinger at the end in the text of "Have we let down his dream?" with a little red question mark, that felt like that. That felt very timely to me, even though we're 19 years later. I think that, not that that question would get asked right now, but in a mainstream film, but those are very good questions to ask.
Yeah. So there's no way today that we could have a like explicitly socialist minded hero on screen
Yeah.
who's an atheist,
Yeah.
who is against caste and against class. Just wouldn't happen. And
I found myself wishing, and I need to look this up. There's a lot about the way they told this story that feels very 70s to me, which those of you, everyone here knows me. I That is a huge compliment coming from me. That you could see, maybe not, but like young Bachchan in this role, you could see, the big multi-stars of the day are in this role, are in some of these roles, and that very communal philosophy being espoused by Javed Akhtar and others, other writers and directors. I think it could have gone over really well. I mean, the approach seems like it would fit very well into that film culture, which had very much fallen by the wayside by the time this film was actually made. And yes, we may not get the criticism of the Congress Party at that time, that's in the film, but I'm not sure that they would have portrayed Gandhi the way they did in this film if it had been made in the 70s. But really, to run with that message of, we must unite across these historical differences and present day differences in order to, work as a nation, feels very, very 1970s to me. And I should look and see if there is a film on Bhagat Singh from that time period. I would not be surprised.
I mean, there's a world of difference between thinking about the kind of revolutionary spirit that's depicted in this film, and then just a few years later we have Rang de Basanti, which is obviously referring to the story as a backdrop, but if we're looking at the cast there in the stories, it's mostly upper middle class kids who are university educated, who are living very comfortable lives.
Yeah.
And who are completely depoliticized except for the fact that one of their friends is killed, and then they're of course swept into this larger thing around corruption, which is of course not necessarily located in any particular group or sector that you can point a finger on and get in trouble for pointing a finger on. So just thinking about the contrast between those two films was interesting for me. How explicitly they really wanted his message to come across here, that he really wasn't for anything that most people would have been comfortable with.
Yeah. And that one of the reviews I read mentioned that he, maybe you read about this and can say a bit more. He actually wrote a treatise about why I am an atheist while he was in prison. And the film just gives it one sentence, I think, at the end. I didn't catch anything other than that, but even that is fairly shocking to have the hero of a film say.
Yeah.
And I was impressed that they got that in there.
They make a point of his sort of relationship with his family really being defined by that. His mother always makes a point saying, like, I know you don't do this, I know you don't do that, but for me, do this, please. And of course, at the very end, when one of the jailers sort of asks him to accept God at the last minute, he tells him off.
Yeah, yeah. That's quite impressive, honestly. I mean, and I don't know what was actually said at the time, but the idea of a 23-year-old having the presence of mind enough to, upon being faced with execution, to say these things is, honestly, I was moved by parts of this. I didn't expect to be, and like overall, I don't love this film, but I was moved. I did find some of the sort of bromance stuff effective. Not really the "we're gonna march cheerfully to the gallows" part, but some of the other parts. I thought they did a nice job. with some of those. And I guess it's not necessary in a story about this historical figure, but um, the idea of causes, forming political causes being the impetus for some emotional bonds, that resonates with me, and I feel like I don't know, I was a bit moved.
Yeah, I think it's realistic, and
Yeah,
young men, have fervor, and
yeah, yeah.
yes, but these also had intelligence and conviction, which is not always something that we get at emotional frat parties.
Right, right, right.
Where there's lots of socializing and warm emotions as well.
We do only have a couple minutes left, but before we go, I want to ask you one more question, and then we can also, if anyone else in the audience has something to say, please put it in the Q&A, and we can bring your mic up. Mary had asked about would you teach this film, and you said no, but are there politically oriented films that you like to show to your students who are not already familiar with Indian history or Indian film?
When it first came out, I did teach Rangvidip Bisanti, but
Mm,
I think that film was it. I think its focus on sort of upper middle class issues is a problem, and the vague sort of critique of corruption is a problem. I guess, I mean, these days I think the big issue in Indian films that has long not really been dealt with but needs to be dealt with is caste. And I think that the film Masan
oh
is
yeah, yeah.
really a powerful film, and one that I really would like to teach next time I'm teaching my film course. So it's not really known for songs and dances or dashing heroines, but uh, I think caste is a huge political issue right now in India, and thinking about Dalit identities and other minority community identities is crucial for our students here to understand why and how Indian politics works as it does.
If I was thinking about, if I could have brought any Indian film into this series, I might have chosen Yuba,
Hmm.
um, partly because I think it's just a pretty powerful film. Um, but there aren't any really that leap to my mind as things I think kind of generalized American campusy audience would that would have enough meat to it that it works well, but also that could be comprehensible without a huge amount of, you know, um, foreknowledge or anything like that. Not much is coming to mind. And there's biopics about Gandhi and things like that, Indian ones, and I don't know, maybe something like that. But this is, I love that. I do appreciate that there's this available on Netflix, something that isn't about Gandhi and brings
Yes.
another story to to a wider audience. I don't know if a lot of people are watching it. Is it the best film ever? No, but it is great to see these other faces.
Yeah.
And if you are inspired by this film to learn a little bit more, they sure do give you a lot of names and events and all to that you can look up and start start digging into if you are so inclined.
I did that this morning. So last thing I'll say, I looked up Lal Lala.
Oh, the
Lal,
school.
yet so the principal of the school, right?
Hmm.
The person who gets murdered, and he actually spent a while sort of traveling around the states in the teens. And he went to Tuskegee and he met Booker T.
Amazing.
Washington with a letter of introduction from W. D. Du Bois.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's kind of a lot of these people that were in the film are actually worth looking up.
Yes.
Um, so I would just say, do look them up, and the film is good, even if Beth says it's not her favorite. It's still quite good.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. Well, I don't see any other Q and A's. Thank you, audience, for the questions and for coming to be with us tonight. You are all friends of ours, literally and
Yes,
figuratively, for being part of our
forever.
conversation forever. Thank you, Mary. We're really glad that you were here. Um, and you all know how to follow Nilanjana on Twitter, so I won't tell you because you already do. And I'll just thank you for being a part of this conversation, and so much, Neela, for being here and for getting to work together finally after 12 years or whatever.
Yes,
I
let's do it
really
again.
appreciate anytime. I'm a little tired of Zoom events, I have to say. However, they enable things like this, which I could never have done you know, I could probably never have flown you out to do a discussion of this in person. So I really appreciate you taking the time to think about this, to watch this film, think about this film, and then share your thoughts with all of us tonight.
No, thank you, Beth. And thank you, audience, Anna
Yay!
and Catherine and Mary. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you again soon online. Bye.
Bye.